Welcome to Farm Here Daily, a Field Forward podcast. I'm your host, David Geiger. Today on Farm Here Daily, we look at some of the biggest legal issues facing agriculture. Kristine Tidgren, director of the ISU Center for Ag Law and Taxation, goes over provisions from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act from last year and what they're watching for in 2026. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Here Daily. And joining me on Farm Here Daily, we're going to take a look at some of the latest legal aspects of agriculture. To do so, we have with us the director of the ISU Center for Ag Law and Taxation, Kristine Tidgren. Kristine, thank you so much for joining me on Farm Here Daily. Happy New Year, and let's talk about the new year and the old year, 2025. First off, what were some of the major legal aspects that you were watching for farmers across the state that had a pretty big impact and or were just very interesting or important to talk about?
Well, David, we had a lot going on the legislative front this year. So we were watching to see if we would get a new farm bill. And instead, what really happened is there was this big piece of legislation that everybody's heard about that was passed on July 4th, 2025. We call it HR1. The popular name for it, although it's not in the statute, is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so I'll call that OBA if I reference it. But OBA really was very multifaceted, and it contained not only provisions specific to farmers that would normally be in a farm bill, it also contained very wide sweeping tax changes. And really, I'd say those two areas are the biggest impact to agriculture in 2025. It also meant we didn't get a traditional farm bill. We did get some funding that continued, so we're not left hanging with 1920 prices coming back in or anything like that. But it did change sort of the trajectory of how a typical farm bill would work, and so we don't know what that will mean for the future.
I appreciate you going right to that part of it, because that was probably one of the biggest questions that I had, and that is, what about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, OBA, what about it really did just draw from a traditional farm bill that we have not seen for, I think it's 8 years now?
Yeah, so OBA did extend the main programs that farmers rely on. So ARC, PLC, and like for example, with respect to PLC, it increased reference prices for the first time in a long time, which was important. Now these changes will be evident to farmers in October of this year. So it's 2026 now. I got to get in that mindset, but I like to say next year, but it's this year now. So October of 26 is really when those program payments will be made for the first time. So it increased some reference prices there. It also increased, made crop insurance a better tool for farmers across the board. And another thing it did in that space that was significant for farmers is we've been stuck at a payment limitation in the code at $125,000 for some time. It did increase that to be $155,000. Now that's for the traditional farm bill programs, ARC, PLC, exact. For example, that is the limit that you could get for those particular programs. Now we have other ad hoc programs that are often made available, and the big example here is the Farmer Bridge program, the program that was announced by USDA at the end of last year, and we're going to actually have payments made to farmers next month. It is a $11 billion program that is intended to bridge the gap between now and when those October payments are made. And so those payments are not reliant on the new provisions in OBA because it's an ad hoc program that the USDA put out there sort of with its authority using CCC funding, et cetera. So that's sort of a different thing, but it did borrow from it in that there is a $155,000 payment limitation on that FBA program as well. And we'll learn more about how that's going to work in the days ahead. It's very a quickly implemented program. Farmers will get an application in the mail. They'll get an application that's already pre-filled because the USDA is going to rely on information they already have based upon the reporting that farmers did after last year's crop year. And so again, these payments are designed because farmers are kind of hurting right now. Low commodity prices, driven in some ways because of trade disputes, things like that, and also high input costs. And so the Farmer Bridge program is intended to compensate farmers somewhat in that space.
The changes to what we typically would have in a farm bill, and having that instead in OBA, made it so that folks aren't really talking about a new farm bill. They're maybe calling it a skinny bill. What is something within what we normally would have within a farm bill that folks have been asking you all at the Center for Ag Law and Taxation that was not included in OBA that's still pretty important, that folks are still confused about, or facing uncertainty, that you think is, either uncertain or maybe muddy water that you're watching?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. The bill that funded the government later in the year took care of some of those issues that we were concerned about. For one thing, OBA didn't do anything about CRP, so it actually expired. But then the bill that reopened the government did extend funding for CRP, so that was kind of a big deal. There are things that, because OBA was passed using reconciliation, which is a process where you have to only have 50%, 51% of the, just over 50% agree. There are limits on what can be in such a bill. And so it had to be only provisions that would impact the budget over 10 years, spending, that type of thing. So there has been a lot of discussion in the last couple of years about things like a state regulating production practices of farmers throughout the country. That was really made most evident with a California law that said that it would not allow into its state the sale of whole pork unless that sow or the pigs were raised in conditions that had certain crate size, that type of thing, that the different amount of space to roam around, all of that. So that has raised a concern among many producers that what if we have a patchwork of different laws throughout the country, where now I have to worry about what, not only what California says about how I have to raise my animals, but also what Maine says, what Florida says. Every state has their own. It can be very difficult. So there has been a lot of discussion about a federal law that could perhaps preempt states from imposing production practices on producers of livestock, just because of the difficulty that it can cause. Because you put your produce, you put your livestock out into the market, and it's very difficult to control where it goes and all of that. And this law in California, for example, Proposition 8, it comes with criminal sanctions if you violate it. So these are pretty heavy laws. So that's one example of something that some had suggested could be in a farm bill, perhaps, just to kind of help ease some of that concern among some of our producers.
Kristine, I'm thinking last year, as a different topic than what we saw in the One Big Beautiful Bill, was that first year where we really had some really big changes. I believe some really big changes to how some level of farmer business worked in terms of legal codification. How did that develop in terms of, I think it was S Corp changes, or was it LLC changes, something like that, on folks were advising farmers to make sure that those were proper because of the shell corporation tax or change?
Oh, right. So interesting. It's been so long. Some of us may have forgotten that we were implementing last year at this time. We were talking about the fact that, hey, you've got to do beneficial ownership reporting on your LLC, on your
Right, that's it.
corporation, on your S corporation. If you do not report who the owners are, you'll be subject to these incredible sanctions, etc. Because this was a law that was passed overwhelmingly by Congress, multiple years ago, but it was not set to go into effect until 2025. Well, as I think most everyone has heard by now, on the regulatory front, that law is not being enforced. There were regulations that have been issued to say, hey, it's you don't have to report if you're a domestic entity, if you're a domestic owner. There is still reporting required for foreign owned businesses, foreign businesses. So if anybody has any hand in any of those, they do need to reach out to legal counsel to figure out what their obligations are. But for now, anyway, now the law hasn't been retracted or anything. It's just been on the regulatory front that there's been a pause. There's no enforcement. So for now, there's no worry about beneficial ownership information reporting. But yes, that was a hot topic last year. And it's interesting you mentioned entities, LLCs, S corporations. Those are pass-through businesses. LLC if they're taxed as a partnership or an S corporation. And there was a really important part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that impacts them. And so I do want to make sure that we discuss that. And that is historically, if you are receiving farm program payments and you're an individual, or if you're in a general partnership that has not formed an entity, then every partner in that general partnership, and if you're an individual, you all have your own payment limitation. So 155,000 for me, if I'm in a general partnership, 155,000 for each of those general partners. But the law has always said if I form an LLC, which would basically just be taking my general partnership and transferring it into a form that allows me to have some liability protection so that if my brother, who is my partner, does something negligent, I won't be personally liable. It's only the entity that's liable, that kind of thing. I mean, that's why we set up things like LLCs. And also, they're very helpful for transitioning the farm business because there's some sort of baked in law provisions and things that give you certainty in terms of what happens when this happens, etc. So there are lots of reasons why it's sometimes advisable to form an entity like an LLC. But in the farm program payment world, you were penalized because if you maintained your general partnership structure, each of the partners had a $155,000 payment limitation. But if you all of a sudden put that in an LLC, the LLC had a $155,000 payment limitation, no matter how many partners there were. So if there were 10, right, then 15,000 per person was all you could get. And so recognizing that, and of course I say 155, that's the new law. So the old law was 125,000. So that changed with OBA as well. But OBA said, we should have equity across entities. So if you're a general partnership or a joint venture, you shouldn't be treated more favorably than somebody who's just made the decision to incorporate as a pass-through business, an LLC or an S corporation for uh, other non-farm program payment reasons. And so they said, we're going to treat those entities equitably. So now, and it won't start for a while. It's not in place even for the farmer bridge programs. The old rule still applies to that. USDA has chosen to apply the old rule to that. So if you are eligible for an FBA payment in February and you're in an LLC, your payment limitation is 155,000. But otherwise, the way OBA is going to work in the future, and we think it'll apply to the October 2026 payments, but we'll have to see and make sure that's true. It will be that each member of that LLC will have a $155,000 payment limit. Each shareholder of an S corporation will have a $155,000 payment limit. So they equalized that. Now, if you're in a C corporation, that's not the rule because this is just for pass-through entities.
Kristine, as we look into the new year, 2026, what are some of the points of issue? We kind of discussed it with, there's still uncertainty and we're not sure how things will properly be affecting certain programs as we head into the year. But what are maybe some other legal issues or issues legal issues or issues. What are some of the other legal issues that we're going to be looking at here for 2026?
Well, I think on the farm side, one of the biggest things that happened in 25 that impacts 26 were the tax provisions that changed in OBA. And so one thing that sometimes farmers worry a lot about are, is there an estate tax that's going to impact me? Is there a estate and gift tax? And OBA said, you know what, we are going to not only allow, it was scheduled, the estate tax exemption, which is the amount of money that you can give away during your lifetime and own when you die, and not have to pay any estate tax. It was set to go down in half at the end of last year. And Congress said, we're not only going to prevent it from going down by half, we're also going to increase it a bit. So we start off 2026 with a $15 million exemption per person, which is very significant in terms of it means that for the most part, most farmers, now there are some very large landholders, all of that, that's great. They've got a lot of money. They can work with great attorneys and things to figure out a plan for accommodating, the least amount of tax they would have to pay if they were to pass. But for the average farmer, that 15 million, and then there's something called portability that remains. And that is if I'm married, then my spouse and I each get a $15 million exemption. And if I pass away before my spouse, then that can be ported over to him so that when he passes away, he has a $30 million exemption. That covers the vast majority of even farm estates. So that is something that means that really tax planning instead of estate tax planning, income tax planning is really the big thing, I think, for 2026, as it has been. But that becomes even more viable. We have a little bit of certainty now. We don't have this $15 million exemption set to expire. Now, I say that with the acknowledgement that a permanent provision in the tax code is only permanent as long as, right, Congress doesn't change its mind. And so we could have a pendulum swing and we could have Congress in several years change the law. Of course, that's the way it is all the time. But right now, we're not staring down a cliff where that exemption is going to lower. So I think a big focus is on income tax planning. And the OBA did make some significant changes there as well. And so we start off the year, we have 100% bonus depreciation. That means that if I buy a tractor or I put up a farm building, I can take a deduction for the entire amount of that purchase. It's kind of a cash flow device. It's like timing of the deduction is really what it is. Also, Section 179, which is a favorite cost recovery tool for farmers because it's very customizable. You can use it as a precision tool. That was increased significantly as well. So we have very good tools at our disposal to be able to tailor our income to what we need it to be. There's also a very interesting provision that it went into effect in the middle of last year, but for most of us, because we're cash accounting farmers, it really only applies starting this year for them. And that is, there's a new provision that says if I sell my farmland to a qualified farmer, then I can take the amount of tax that I would normally pay on that sale, and I don't have to pay it all at once. I can divide it up into 4 chunks and I can pay it over 4 years. Now, that is not a savings of calculation of the tax. You're not going to pay a lower tax. It's all about, again, time value of money. You'll save some interest on that. You'll save some money in that regard. So that is a brand new provision we've never seen before. It was put into place to encourage people to sell their land, because of the provision we talked about before with the high estate tax exemption. And when you die, the basis of your property steps up to fair market value. So there are big incentives to kind of hold your land till you die. And so the idea is maybe this would encourage some people to sell their land, maybe to beginning farmers, people who want to continue to farm it. So that's kind of an exciting new provision that came about because of the OPA.
Kristine, I'm sure we could spend a full 30 minutes talking specifically about that, but I did want to talk quickly about a related topic, and that is the folks over there that you work with at Center for Ag Law and Taxation have been putting together a lot of materials for passing on the farm and writing that into the business and what folks are doing. Can you tell me a little bit about that and maybe some of the resources you have to share since we're on that topic?
Absolutely. So we spent a good chunk of last year working together. We at the center also worked with our whole farm management team, a lot of our livestock specialists, and we also contracted with a mediation specialist to create a comprehensive resource of a portal where people can go online, they can watch educational videos, they can download case studies, they can learn from, like I said, a farm mediation expert about tips and how to talk to family members and all of that. And then it also comes along with a 200-page workbook that has been very important in terms of just giving all the details of what is involved in an estate and succession plan and what is it that we need to be considering. And we came up with this project. We implemented it because we recognize that people are holding on to their property, and most Iowa farmland is owned by people over the age of 65. I think it's only 9% that's owned by anybody under the age of 50, right? It's kind of crazy. So there's going to be a lot of farm property that's going to change hands in the next 10 years. And we looked out and we see that there just weren't enough people that have written estate and succession plans in place. It's a pressing need. And we also realized that sometimes it's easy to put that off because first of all, we don't want to think about our deaths. We don't want to think about maybe becoming disabled. We don't want to think about those things. So it's easier just to pretend they don't exist. But if we do that, then we make things a lot more difficult for people down the road. And we also don't get to have anyone consider our own wishes and desires. So if you get going on an estate and succession plan, and you really put it in writing. Maybe you did something 20 years ago, and that was when you had kids that were 10 and 12, and now those kids are all grown up, right? And you need to change things. This information applies to people kind of at all stages. And so we've integrated current law, current tax situations, all of that you can learn at your own pace. And so that's available if you go to our website. There's a estate and succession planning for the farm button at the top. You can go out there and kind of learn about the portal.
Kristine Tidgren is the director for the Iowa State University Center for Ag Law and Taxation. Kristine, thank you so much for joining me on Farm Here Daily.
Thank you for having me.
This is Farm Here Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, in order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community. So please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports. Again, I'm your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again on Monday. Have a good weekend, everybody.